Greetings to you all, and welcome back. Today I have intention of musing about the Muses. Now, at the end of one of my late videos, the video on culture, I closed with a question regarding the possibility of reconciling the idea of the Muses with the idea of Christian culture. A question, that is to say, about what the status is of the Muses within the Christian worldview. And I have the unconfirmed sense that some of the people who saw that question might have responded to it something like, So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, try and add some clarity. And I want to begin with a general observation. There's some tension between the idea of art on the one hand and the idea of Christianity on the other. There are circles of Christianity which are even quite ready to condemn the arts as such. They frown upon popular music. Some of them frown even upon classical music. They have in the past cast aspersions and doubts on the novel, on poetry, love songs, and many things of the kind. And some of them have regarded practically the entire development of the Western visual arts, beginning from the Renaissance on, as being a long history of decline, not to say perversion and outright degeneration. So when I pose the question of the status of the Muses in the Christian worldview, this is what I have in mind. Now, on the other hand, there have been great Christian artists, unambiguously Christian artists who are considered Christian even by the most closed and exacting of these cultural critics. St. Gregory of Nazianzus, for example, was a celebrated poet, and he's also one of only 3 men who was officially granted the title of theologian by the Orthodox Church. In the Orthodox Church, there are many other such uncontested examples, such as St. Andrei Rublev, the great Russian iconographer, or any other iconographer who's ever been officially acknowledged as such by the Church. Similarly, there are the composers of the church hymns. So the question really seems to concern a certain category of the arts, which is to say those arts which are non-sacramental or non-liturgical. The popular arts, for example, or else the arts which fall outside of the purview of the church itself. And this is where things get interesting. Now, the arts which fall within the purview of the church are considered to be in some way the work or the fruit of the Holy Spirit. What is the status of those that fall outside of the church? What is it exactly which inspires these works of art? Are there many things? Are they simply reducible to the works of gifted individuals, as is sometimes suggested by a kind of romantic cult of the genius? Or are there other forces at play here? Maybe even other intelligences, and some hostile to the life of man. If you consider, for example, the Faust legend and what it tries to tell us about the ways in which a human being might be inspired by darker agencies in this world, the question does get very complicated indeed. And here enter the Muses. Now, the Muses are fascinating here because they give us at once insight into some of the oldest recognized views about the inspiration of works like these, and at the same time they can be found even referenced all the way up until some of the very latest works of art in our own day. There's something eternal about the Muses, about the relevance of the Muses for the arts and the fascination that artists have for them. There's something about them which can help us to clarify the nature of the arts and the nature of the artist, his work in the world. So, per my usual approach, I'm going back to the beginning. It happens that there's a very fascinating correspondence here between some of the very earliest poetry that we have in our Western traditions and the idea of the Muses. The first mention of the Muses that we have in our literature goes back to the Greek poet Hesiod. Now, Hesiod in much of our public education is eclipsed behind Homer, and so it's very easy for us in our limited perspective to underestimate his importance for the Greeks and his importance for the entirety of the history which followed him. Part of this is down to the fact that, like with Homer, we only really have 2 complete poems by Hesiod, and these poems are somewhat less dramatic and exciting than the Iliad and the Odyssey. They don't have the same personal draw that those 2 stories have, and this has led, I think, to a lot of confusion about Hesiod and his nature as a poet. Hesiod is also far more afflicted than Homer is by a certain ugly tendency in modern academia. Namely, the tendency to regard the figures of the distant past as being nothing more than bumbling children who had no idea what they were actually doing, who really had no idea what they thought or why, and who came up with these sorts of fairy tales just because they were living in an unenlightened and dark world in which nothing was really clear, science hadn't yet shed its powerful illumination on things, and it was very easy to get confused. This is the view according to which the Greeks invented Zeus because they wanted to be able to explain where lightning came from, for example. This is the view according to which neither Socrates nor Plato were really aware that some of the arguments that are made in the Platonic dialogues are patently and visibly false. This is the view according to which that poor infantile antiquity had to be left behind for hundreds and hundreds of years before we could finally get to a point where we could start to reason like human beings. And it is the view of people who have never really seriously read any of this literature. Because the moment you begin to really seriously read this literature is the moment you abandon these facile and contemptible modern prejudices. Fortunately, there are a couple of quick signs to tell you whether or not somebody actually takes Hesiod seriously. For example, if you ever hear anybody refer to chaos or Erebus or night as being gods, then you know that person has never really carefully read Hesiod. Or again, if you ever hear anybody call Hesiod a poet, as I have done several times in the course of this video, you know that there's something wrong there as well. Because Hesiod never once refers to poetry. He never uses the word. He never uses the Greek equivalent of the word, at least in this context. And he certainly never refers to himself as a poet anywhere in his work. Hesiod speaks of singing, of song, not of poetry. And it was this song that was given to him by the Muses. Now, probably the most important work of Hesiod is the Theogony, a work, one could say, of cosmology, or of the description of the beginning of things, where the world came from, where the gods came from. And the Theogony itself begins with a description of the Muses. So we'll begin there as well. The first lines of the Theogony read as follows. Let us begin our singing from the Heliconian Muses, who possess the great and holy mountain of Helicon, and dance there on soft feet by the dark blue water of the spring, and by the altar of the powerful son of Cronos, who wash their tender bodies in the waters of Parmesos, or Hippocrene, spring of the horse, or holy Olmeos, and on the high places of Helicon have ordered their dances, which are handsome and beguiling, and light are the feet they move on. From there they rise, and put a veiling of deep mist upon them, and walk in the night, singing in sweet voices, celebrating Zeus, the holder of the Aegis, and Hera, his lady of Argos, who treads on golden sandals. He continues then by describing how the Muses first came to him, to Hesiod, and gave him the power of song. And it was they who once taught Hesiod his splendid singing as he was shepherding his lambs on holy Helicon. And these were the first words of all the goddesses spoke to me, the Muses of Olympia, daughters of Zeus of the Aegis. You, shepherds of the wilderness, poor fools, nothing but bellies. We know how to say many false things that seem like true sayings, but we know also how to speak the truth when we wish to. So they spoke, these mistresses of words, daughters of great Zeus, and they broke off and handed me a staff of strong growing olive shoot, a wonderful thing. They breathed a voice into me, and power to sing the story of things of the future, and things past. They told me to sing the race of the blessed gods everlasting, but always to put themselves at the beginning and the end of my singing. So Hesiod was a shepherd on Mount Helicon, and by his own account he was approached by these beings, these muses, these divinities, and he was given song by them. Now we're tempted in our time to read this allegorically and to say that he's simply speaking metaphorically of some kind of a poetic event that occurred to him, some kind of inspiration which came to him, which he then embodies in the form of these poetic beings, these muses. That's preferable to the other tendency, which is to say that Hesiod was simply hallucinating, or he was just too childishly idiotic to understand that what he was seeing wasn't actually a divinity at all, but, I don't know, maybe a shepherdess or a tree. The one thing that we never actually take seriously is the possibility that he actually encountered some kind of spiritual beings here. We're inclined to regard that as being a sort of superstition, when in fact it's actually our superstition that such things never happen. So let's try for a moment to take Hesiod very seriously about this, and let's just assume that he means this quite literally. There are just a few things that I want to say about this, and there are many, many more that could be said. This poem is of such a density and such a richness that I could easily spend hours and hours trying to unravel the various knots that are easily found within it. But I want to focus on the muses themselves and what we're told about the muses. And the first thing that I'd like to focus on is the obscurity of the muses, this kind of lack of clarity which surrounds them, this mist or fog that surrounds them. They're described as wrapping themselves in mists. They're described as coming in the night. Hesiod doesn't tell us at what time of the day he actually encounters them, but he also never says that he sees them, that he lays eyes on them. The only thing that's given to us is their voice, and this is very striking because it's one of the only times in the entirety of the Theogony in which human beings and gods interact with one another. This is the only direct speech which is ever given in the entire course of the poem by a god to a human being. The muses are somehow the point of connection between the divinity, the divine realm, and humanity, the human realm. They form a bridge between these two different worlds, and in consequence, the singer is also a bridge between these two different worlds, because the singer is invested with the voice, the potency of the muses. Now, the muses don't sing to the singer. The muses speak to the singer. The muses sing to the gods. This occurs later in the poem. Hesiod writes, "Come you then, let us begin from the muses, who by their singing delight the great mind of Zeus their father, who lives on Olympus, as they tell of what is and what is to be and what was before now, with harmonious voices, and the sound that comes sweet from their mouths never falters, and all the mansion of Zeus the father of the deep thunder is joyful in the light voice of the goddesses that scatters through it, and the peaks of snowy Olympus re-echo in the homes of the immortals, and they in divine utterance sing first the glory of the majestic race of the immortals from its beginning." The muses come in obscurity. and they come bringing word of divinities. They come bringing word of the first things and the last things. They tell Hesiod the secrets of all of the cosmos, the way that the cosmos developed and unfolded in its development. They bring him wisdom, and he in turn sings this wisdom to human beings. And all of that seems straightforward enough in its way, but there's a complication, because the Muses tell Hesiod quite explicitly that they don't always tell the truth. We know how to say many false things that seem like true sayings, but we also know how to speak the truth when we wish to. So the question has to arise. Are the Muses telling the truth? Are they giving Hesiod a true account of the origins of things? And is Hesiod transferring that true account to us? Or are they lying? Are these the true things that they speak of, or are these the false things that they're capable of telling? And is it not suggestive that they come wrapped in mist and move in night? There's a fundamental ambiguity here that we can't get around. There's something about poetry which is obscure. There's something about all human song and writing which is obscure, ambiguous, equivocal. All of the best literature is like this. None of it is perfectly transparent. The reason that it is great is because it continuously inspires ongoing debate and discussion. It inspires its own doubts and double perspectives and multiplicities of views into the minds of those who actually live with it and dwell with it. This is its richness. This is a basic part of what differentiates Shakespeare from Dan Brown or Hesiod from Stephen King. But if all that we have when we read these works are lies, what then? This is the crux of another great dispute in antiquity, that between philosophy and poetry. And in fact, the word poet very likely comes to us from Plato more than anywhere else, which is not to say that the word didn't exist before him, but it was Plato's use of this word which really brought it to the foreground. It's probably because of Plato that we speak of poets today and not singers, or bards, or something else. And Plato had a lot to critique in the poets. And Plato was not particularly happy about the poets in a lot of cases. He knew the poets, he cited them with great liberty, but he also indicated the limitations in the poets. The poets are not philosophical. They cannot reflect on their own work in the same way that a philosopher can, because the poets are accepting something into themselves and they're letting it flow through them. The poets are vessels or mouthpieces for something else. And so can their work be trusted? Since a great deal of disparate material comes into the mind of the poet and then comes out again, if the poet does not have the ability to actually question these things to the bottom, to the very pith of them, and to try to differentiate between the truth and the falsehood in them, is the poet reliable? Or is the poet just a lying dog-faced pony soldier? This I ask you. Let's return to Hesiod for a moment, because Hesiod actually has some things to say about this. The Muses say something very interesting to Hesiod when they first encounter him. They say that the shepherds of the wilderness are just poor fools, nothing but bellies. Now, the word that's used here for belly in ancient Greek also means hunger. Now, of course, part of this just indicates that shepherds have very difficult lives. They're constantly involved in the business of trying to feed themselves and others. Their lives revolve in a certain way around food. And so this might indicate that there's a certain lowness of the priorities of the shepherds, which complicates their relationship to what the Muses want to give to Hesiod. But then why in the world would the Muses have come to Hesiod? And I think here we find a double meaning which actually tells us precisely why. The word that's used for stomach here in ancient Greek also means hunger. There's a suggestion here that what the Muses are actually getting at is the hunger inside of Hesiod. That Hesiod is somehow hungry for something. And here there are all kinds of things that we could bring out. The shepherds live in the wilderness. The old way of shepherding, which was very different from the contemporary modern way of shepherding, involved transhumance. The shepherds would travel across very, very large stretches of land, carrying their sheep with them, and they'd sleep out in the wilderness under the stars. Now, the Greeks had an impressively refined sensibility for the cosmic order, which was embodied in some way or embedded in the starry heavens above them. They looked up into the heavens and they saw a divine order, to be sure, which is not immediately clear, a divine order which is anything but transparent, but a divine order which follows regular patterns, that has a certain degree of cyclicality to it. It's not arbitrary or accidental. And it was this sensibility which in part led ancient Greece to the great flourishing of philosophy and the arts that we see in it. Now, the shepherd would have an unusual degree of contact with this kind of a world. The shepherd is not a being of the city. The shepherd is a being of the wilderness. But the shepherd is also not a wild beast. The shepherd is the point of contact between the wilderness and the city, between the organic world beyond the boundaries of civilization and the orderly, structured, civilized world in which human beings like to dwell. The shepherd is a liminal being, and this liminality produces a certain strange character in the shepherd. Now, in the land where I presently live, shepherding is a big deal. There are more sheep that live in this region of Italy than there are human beings, and there are long-standing traditions of shepherding here in this land. As a consequence of this, there are many traditions which issued from this, and all of them are very beautiful, and some of them are very interesting to what we're talking about now. There are certain kinds of music which developed here, and not only here, but also in places like Greece and Spain, which takes us directly back to the life of the shepherd in the wilderness. Music which emerged from the spontaneous sounds surrounding the shepherd on a constant basis. Things like bird song and the calls of animals and the wind, but also the sound of the bells that the shepherd would put on the sheep, and the sound of the voices of the sheep themselves. This gave rise to a certain kind of musicality and a certain kind of sensibility to musicality in the heart of the shepherd. The shepherd becomes a point at which artistic creation begins. This liminal being, living constantly on the verge of complete disorder and chaos and wildness, but at the same time connected to the human world, becomes a vessel for the human world in the wilderness, and for the wilderness in the human world. He's a point of contact, a mediating point between these two things. And similarly in Hesiod, he's being called upon to be a mediating point between the divinities and the human world below. The shepherd's very role is to be a guide and a protector. And this is another very interesting facet of this question, because the word shepherd in many different languages, ancient Greek included, comes also to refer to human beings who have positions of authority. Our word pastor, or priest, comes from the old Latin word for shepherd. Kings could be described as shepherds. Agamemnon in Homer is described as a shepherd of his people. Now, the highest kind of authority which is given to human beings has to have some kind of a connection in something higher still, whether that be a transcendent realm of principles, abstract moral principles, or whether it be a connection to the world of the divine, the world of God's heavenly law. And we see different variations on this over the course of human history, but the moment that that link is broken between the highest human authority and something higher than any human authority is the moment that we see tyranny emerge in the world. Because that's the point at which the highest human authority becomes the final arbiter for all considerations and all questions, be they legal or moral or personal. That is when we see the emergence of the terrible abuse of power, which has always existed in human societies, and has taken on in recent years an even more troubling connotation on account of the advent of modern technologies, which augment that power to extraordinary levels and permit devastation and destruction in ways that have never been known before. So this connection between authority and divinity is of fundamental importance, even if it's only wanly reflected in things like the idea of first principles or self-evident truths or things like this. So the shepherd, Hesiod, becomes as well a kind of symbol for this sort of authority. But it's not a political authority, it's something else. The shepherd stands in relation to political authority in much the same way that the muses stand in relation to the authority of the highest gods. The muses sing for these gods. They bring sweetness to these gods. They sing the glories of these gods. And as Hesiod also describes in his poem, the muses inspire these authorities, or even the lords of the earth, with the power of eloquence and persuasion, which is a fundamental part of political authority. The highest political authority depends on this other authority, this authority which is given to the shepherd, rightly understood, this authority which is given to the poet or the singer. And this is connected as well in the poem to the ability to reconcile disputes, to clarify disagreements, to come to terms. The muses are fundamental for the keeping of peace, and so also the poet, the singer. But there is a difference between wisdom and sweetness. There is a difference between a song which permits one to know the world and a song which permits one to forget about one's pains. And part and parcel of all of this is the muse's ability to bring joy and light into the world, and to help human beings forget their miseries. So, at the end of his Ode to the Muses, Hesiod sings the following. The lords are from Zeus, but blessed is that one whom the muses love, for the voice of his mouth runs and is sweet. And even when a man has sorrow fresh in the troublement of his spirit, and is struck to wonder over the grief in his heart, the singer, the servant of the muses singing the glories of ancient men, and the blessed gods who have their homes on Olympus, makes him presently forget his cares. He no longer remembers sorrow, for the gifts of the goddesses soon turn his thoughts elsewhere. The goddesses have the ability to turn men away from sorrow and toward joy. But this is not a question of knowledge. This is not a question of wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom imply remembering, and this is a question of forgetting. Now here's a fascinating part about the Muses in Hesiod's account. Because Hesiod begins with the Muses, as the Muses themselves bid him do, and ends with the Muses in his poem, the Muses become the first and the last things in the entire poem. And we forget that the Muses, in the actual genealogy which is given of the gods themselves, the actual theogony, are very late come. They are some of the last divinities to be born. and they are born to the goddess mnemosyne, memory. The Muses are imbued with the power of remembering, but the Muses bring forgetfulness. Similarly, the Muses are part of a specific genealogy in the Theogony, the genealogy which proceeds from Gaia, the earth. Another thing you'll often hear, even from Hesiod scholars, shockingly enough, is that there's only a single genealogy in the Theogony, namely the genealogy which springs from chaos, chaos being the first thing absolutely. But there's actually no indication of this. It is never stated by Hesiod that Gaia comes from chaos, and there is no intersection whatsoever between the beings which are actually said to come from chaos on the one hand, and the beings which are said to come from Gaia on the other. We're dealing with two completely different divine genealogies here, and that alone could be the topic of an entire conversation. So to all of you out there who would actually like to hear about this, and really dig into Hesiod, and really figure out what he's saying about the origins of things, I mean, to those of you who really just kind of nerd out on this stuff, you are my people. I appreciate you. And I might do that one day, to the detriment of all the people who really couldn't care less and think that these are really trivial topics that nobody but scholars should be talking about. I would so happily really just take this down to the granular level and break this apart and try and actually look at what's going on with this genealogy of the gods, because it is fascinating when you get down there, and there are so many wild questions which come out of it. I'm getting pumped up just talking about this. Let's do this another time. We'll do it another time. But right now, I'm just going to glide right over that like it's not even a problem. The point here is that there are these two separate genealogies, and I'm going to insist on this. It's even more complicated than this, but just for now, I'm going to say that there are two genealogies of the divinities in Hesiod, one which comes from chaos and the other which comes from Gaia. The Muses come from Gaia. They are divinities in the line of Zeus. They are the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, memory. The other distinct genealogy of chaos, again, doesn't intersect with this Gaian genealogy at all. There's no point of contact between the two. There's no interbreeding between the two lines of divinities. There is even a question whether chaos and all of chaos's spawn are divinities at all, or if they are gods, or what are they? They're only referred to as the immortals. They're never called gods. All you people who call them gods, just take it easy for a moment. Just take it easy. The first two issues of the genealogy of chaos are Erebus and Nyx, that is to say, darkness and night. And here's where things get interesting, because the Muses come in darkness and in night, and they walk barefoot upon the earth. The gods themselves are described as walking upon the earth in sandals. The Muses walk barefoot. This is important. These things are important. If you think that Hesiod just didn't care about any of this and he was just writing things that came to him, then you haven't read his poem. And if you had read his poem, you would take me to task for calling it a poem. The Muses in some way participate in both of these kinds of genealogies. The Muses in some way are able again to bridge these two different realities. The Muses are liminal beings in exactly the same way that the poet or the singer becomes a liminal being. And the Muses are capable of doing this because they have memory. They are the daughters of memory. So they can recall the origins of things. Here's another question I'm not going to get into. Just what does it mean for them to be the daughters of memory? How can we be sure that the Muses know all the things that they're telling us? We haven't even talked about the founts of the world in Hesiod, that horrible place where not even the gods like to go. There is a world here. I'm gliding over this very freely, and I'm still being too complicated for the purposes of this video. So I'm sorry. It's the fault of the subject matter. Ain't me, friends. Ain't me. It's kind of me. All right, so I want to step back. I want to recapitulate. I want to take all these things that I've been saying and try to make some sense of them now. So we come back now to the question of the honesty of the Muses. The Muses admit that they lie. So why believe the Muses? And I think the answer to this question is because the Muses admit that they lie. If the Muses wanted to lie to Hesiod, if they wanted to lie to the singer or the poet, they would never tell the singer or the poet that they were liars, unless they're playing a game of, like 3D chess or something. The poet or the singer receives the truth from the Muses. The real question is whether the poet or the singer sings the truth to everybody else. The power of remembering is also the power of being able to compel forgetting. This is the power of the historian. The historian, if he does not feel a kind of compulsion to write everything that he knows, and no historian ever feels this compulsion because there's too much to write, inevitably also promotes a kind of forgetting. The historian decides what's going to be remembered and what's going to be forgotten. And the Muses do the same thing. And consequently, the poets and the singers do the same thing. They take all of the material that they're given and they select from it. They choose from it. And they produce from that their poem or their song. And that poem or song promotes a kind of forgetting and a kind of remembering. The poets or the singers are always to some extent liars, in this special way at least. Look, I'm a poet, so I feel like I'm kind of compromising myself here, but it's the truth. Okay, so let's step back for a moment and let's just recapitulate everything that we've seen here. The poet is a very peculiar figure. The poet stands at the outer boundaries of so many different spheres. He is like a tangential being at the very point of contact between spheres which don't otherwise intersect. He is a liminal being, to use that description again. He is the point of connection between wilderness and city, between divinity and humanity. He is the point of connection between the first things and the last things. He is the point of connection between chaos and order. And he is allowed to be this because there are forces in the world which give him inspiration. And these forces are highly ambiguous. They are not clear. You do not see them. They walk clothed in mist and darkness. Now enter Christianity. Christianity is a religion of light. At least it's supposed to be. The problem, of course, is not Christianity so much as we Christians. We Christians are not always a force for light. We Christians are more often a force for something other than light. But I'm going to let that diatribe go until another time. Christianity stands against the old initiatic traditions. The old initiatic traditions propose that religion is a kind of hierarchy or a movement toward higher levels of being, which depends fundamentally on secrecy and the mysteries surrounding those higher levels. Christianity abolishes this. There is no such thing as an initiatic tradition in Christianity as it was understood prior to Christianity. Christianity, we could say, makes the mysteries plain to the extent that it can, because there are some mysteries that you can only perceive if you've gotten to a certain level of awareness or had a certain kind of experience. But Christianity abhors the idea of a deliberate mystery, like a mystery which is imposed on people to keep them close-minded or darkened. Christianity abhors the obfuscation of the mystery, or at least, again, it should be. I know that Christianity has been obscurantist at various points in its history. It's not what I'm getting at. I'm trying to get to the original sense of Christianity, its original approach to these problems. Poetry seems to be the deliberate propagation of a certain kind of mystery, and the beings which bring poetry into the world, which inspire poetry into human beings, are themselves vessels of ambiguity, ambiguous beings, highly ambiguous beings. It's no accident that the one form of human art which actually takes its name directly from the Muses is music. Music is the least articulate of the arts. It is the least clear in a certain kind of a way. Right? Emotionally, it's very clear. It's almost immediately evident on an emotional level. But it's not rational in the way that the other arts can be, at least in many ways. But I mean, the written arts demand a level of rationality because they're dealing in language. The plastic arts demand a degree of rationality if they're going to be portraying anything at all. Then we get into the extremes of things like abstract art, which might even push that rationality to the point of absurdity, and then absurdist art, which pushes that absurdity into the point of absurdity. But music is the inarticulate art. And even its use of words in things like popular music or classical opera is very intriguing because it seems to take language and to make language into something that language wasn't really supposed to be. Or it gives a different dimension to language. It overlays on top of the rationality of language this strata of a kind of irrational or super-rational musical immediacy. So music, again, this art which takes its name from the Muses, is basically somehow cloudy, basically somehow nebulous, unclear. That's very telling. So what do we do with all of this? Now the question is, how exactly can we adjudicate the origins or the fount of artistic inspiration? How can we make any sense of it? Now, the artist is such a strange animal. The artist has to open himself to any number of currents or impetuses, stimuli in the world surrounding him. And some of these influences are very subtle and very difficult to characterize. Some of them are very troubling. I mean, you see the way that artists are inspired nowadays, for example, and you really have to wonder, what's actually doing the inspiring here? I mean, is this actually something we want from human beings? The artist can open himself to very disturbing things. And that openness itself is kind of a question. What is that? Is that not inherently dangerous and even reckless of a human being to just open yourself up to the world and even its least material and most spiritual parts? Is that not dangerous both to the artist personally and also to the artist's relation to his public, to the people who will be, as we like to say today, consuming his art? And I just pause to say that that is such an ugly expression. I'm sorry I used that. What does it mean to consume the art? It's like art. Okay, just an irritation of mine, This is part of the reason that the artist is suspect. This is the part of the reason that the poet has always been suspect. That liminality carries with it a certain degree of mistrust. You cannot be a human being continually standing on the outermost boundary of conventionality and just expect people to look at you with a great degree of faith. All the more so because the power that is inherent to what you are doing is so visible. The arts can change the course of history. The arts can influence figures in authority. The arts can alter the temperament of society. The arts are very powerful. So one would like to be able to say exactly where they come from and what they want to do in the world. And you can't. And that's the rub. All right, so before we come to this grave problem, I want to come to another use of the word muse, and one which I think is very relevant and very revealing. In a kind of colloquial way, but also a very beautiful way, we will talk about an artist's muse, meaning a woman that he loves, potentially even a lover. And I say woman just because it's usually gone that way, but of course there are also cases of women artists having male muses. Somehow this beloved human being produces the kind of inspiration that one would associate with the divinities themselves, with the muses. And this is fascinating. This is such a fascinating connection, because there's certainly something about love which is just so stimulating to art. There's something about that raw connection between two human beings which produces this kind of static electricity which can produce great art, or at least the favorable conditions under which great art can be produced. And there's something about the sensibility of the artist which is so intimately drawn to that. One can imagine a philosopher who doesn't have a wife, for example. That seems to be the standard with the philosophers. And even with the philosophers who had wives, like Socrates, it's sort of like they're trying to show you how absurd it is that they should have wives at all. But Xanthippe and Socrates did not have the best of home relationships. It wasn't exactly an ideal marriage. Now, the philosopher is kind of like a solitary being, but the artist, without some kind of a great love in his life, feels strangely hollow or incomplete. There's something missing there, and I think it comes back to this issue of him being a liminal being. He needs to be connected in some way to that social order which he also, in a certain other sense, transcends or tries to continually break away from so that he can free himself of its constraints and see it more clearly and produce his work without the limiting restraints that are put on it by that kind of a social order. And so he needs a bridge of his own, and that bridge can come through love. It can come through a beloved human being. And if you look at the lives of the great artists, it's remarkable how recurrent this theme actually is. Dante, with his love for Beatrice, is perhaps the greatest paragon of this kind of a pattern, because the artist, in his character and in his work, is so bound up in love. Now, the other interesting thing about this idea of the artist's personal muse, that this lover or this beloved who inspires him in such a profound way, is that this human being is a human being. We're talking about an embodied entity. This is not a spiritual ideal somewhere floating around. This is a human being, a person. There's a corporality, there's a physicality, there's a materiality to this relationship, and it forms a basic part of it. Because again, the poet or the artist forms this kind of bridge between the material and the spiritual. Art itself is an embodied practice. It is a practice of bringing things into physical creation around us. And this is true of all of the arts. It doesn't matter if it's the plastic arts, where this is particularly evident, or the literary arts, where what you're producing are words but also ideas and thoughts, or the musical arts, in which sounds and emotions are the product, the creation of your work. You're always acting on the world, on the material world surrounding us, and changing it in some way. And so it's necessary for this to be strictly connected to the physical existence that we have. This is where certain kinds of asceticisms, be they Christian or otherwise, look on the artists, sometimes with mistrust, sometimes with scorn, because there's a tendency in asceticism to divide oneself from the material. In the best of cases, there's a tendency to try to gain mastery over the material existence. In the worst of cases, we're talking about a kind of evasion from materiality, a kind of escape from materiality, an attempt to sunder the human being at his very root and divide him in his body and his soul, and to call the one thing real and the other thing false. And the artist will have none of this. The artist can have none of this. The artist is too firmly bound up in both of these worlds. So, with all of this having been said, what is the guarantee that the artist is going to be taking from the right kinds of inspiration? Where can we find the guarantee that the artist is not pulling out of the ether things which are damaging or harmful or wicked or bad, but rather things that are bright and good, things that are beneficial to our woebegone race, things that will bring human beings to a higher level of existence and not a more degenerate and degraded one? And I think the only guarantee can be the artist himself. The only guarantee that there can possibly be is the integrity of the artist. The artist is a liminal being as well between good and evil. The artist is caught in this drama of human life and has to be able to see all aspects of it. But he's also forced to choose. He's forced to choose which side he's going to stand on, whether he's going to be an artist of the light or an artist of the darkness, whether and how he's going to bring truth or falsity, joy or despair. It is impossible to abandon art in human life. Human life without art is not worth living. When Nietzsche says that art in some way justifies human existence, I have to agree with him on this. If you extend the idea of art broadly enough, you even arrive at things like craftsmanship. You cannot have done with these things. These are continuations of our physical embodiment in the world, of the fact that we are embodied beings. This is part of the beauty of our existence, and it has to be embraced. But this makes for a tremendous responsibility on the part of the artist, because it's the artist who has to be able to filter the good influences from the bad. It's the artist who has to be able to choose wisely between the various different things that might inform his work. The artist has to maintain this just incredible balancing act between being open and receptive to the entirety of the world and not letting that destroy or ruin him or compromise what it is he's doing. There are a few more difficult tasks that could confront a human being, I think. But there are also a few more beautiful tasks. And perhaps the most important thing is that the artist chooses wisely his muses, for that can make all the difference. There are human experiences and dimensions of our human experience which cannot be attained by a single human being alone. You either go to these places in the company of a beloved or you don't go there at all. The artist is intent on opening doors. The artist is intent on seeing all aspects of the world. The artist needs love. The artist cannot exist without love. And because of the way that we human beings are built, it is only right and fitting that the artist should seek one love, one human being who in some way inspires him toward those ends. One human being in whom the fullness of all of this experience really comes to light and can really give birth to something that's beautiful and good. And this might be the finest and truest meaning of the word muse in our language. And on that note, I'm going to bring an end to this. My ducks have been chattering throughout the entirety of this. I put them in their cage, and they're still chattering quite loudly because they are very angry about being in their cage. They are very angry with me today, my ducks are. I hope that hasn't been too distracting. I'm just going to go ahead and apologize to you all if it has been. I can think of a couple of solutions to this, and only one of them actually involves dinner. In any case, distractions or no, I want to thank you all for joining me for this. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the muses. I'd love to hear your thoughts about culture and the arts and the position of the artist and what in the world we're to do with all of this. I hope that this has all explicated a little bit more clearly what I was talking about when I said that the muses represent a kind of problem to me. There's a lot more that could be said about this. There's a lot more that could be said just about Hesiod, and I'll probably want to say it one day, but I appreciate you joining me at least for this, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next time. In the meantime, remember, please subscribe to my channel, leave a like on this video, share this video with other people who might be interested in hearing about Hesiod. There's so many of us, it's just this undiscovered and vast niche of human beings who really just want to get to the bottom of what Hesiod was really doing. What was Hesiod really doing? What was he doing? We've got to know. Let's find out together. Okay, enough. Thanks again, and until next time, farewell.
Huh? Man,